So welcome and everyone to this session, Monetization Post-IDFA. A little bit about myself. My name is Andre. I am the head of data sciences here at Tilting Point. I have been in the industry for over 10 years now. My career started making games when the iPhone just had begun, then entered the world of dynamic pricing with a company called Gondola. And here I am today at Tilting Point managing all data needs in the company. And really what that means is focusing everything from UA to player optimization and et cetera. Tilting Point is, for developers in the sense that we work with developers in trying to make this equation work, and this whole funnel of monetization from the ideation all the way to finding the right alternative distribution channels. That also obviously does mean then that we are also very interested in publishing games, where we start off in the CPI test phase and the growth phase, and we try to make a game that is great even better. And finally, supporting alternative platforms. Alternative platforms are not hard to unlock. However, if you're a single game developer with 2 or 3 titles, the effort required to start using something like Steam is kind of prohibitive sometimes for what you gain. And that is where Tilting Point comes in again, as to unlock these platforms for you out of the box. So now let's go back to the title of the conversation, which is really how do you monetize post-IDFA? I think for the last year, the whole industry has been talking about IDFA and what it would mean and would it be the end of the world. But I think what's important is that there's a connection between IDFA and the evolution of privacy and also the evolution of what is to be publishing. When Tilting Point started, it was still the golden years of where you have perfect tracking with MAC addresses and UDIDs, and basically everything we could do anything at that time in terms of optimization for ads and targeting, and it got even better in some ways when they introduced IDFA. IDFA allowed, it took a lot of the hassle out of the publisher or the developer to find the right target for the game and for the right players for the game. And it allowed the ad networks to actually do all the hard work for us, right? So all the Facebook targeting started coming up, a couple of years ago. It took over with machine learning. And the developer could basically say, I have this very interesting game that I think it's for women between 23 and 25 who like soccer, and Facebook would do it for us. And obviously, then GDPR came along and CCPA, and that obviously, turned us back a little, turned down a notch. And eventually we're here now at IDFA tracking. I think what's interesting about this is that in every one of these steps, especially the last 2, right, GDPR and IDFA, is that the thought was, oh man, it's going to get a lot harder. And I actually think it doesn't get harder. I think it opens opportunities to make bigger changes. Because what happened with perfect tracking, right, when we had IDFA introduced, is that it was all being taken over by machine learning. And machine learning is great, and it automates a lot of work for us. At the same time, it makes it that you can't change anything in your game, because if you change the game or the creative or the ads, you have to retrain the model. And so there was almost a paralysis in some ways of like, let's change very little and hope that the algorithm does the work for us. And now we're in this apocalypse, or maybe is it, of going back to an age of no tracking, which is really cool, I think, because no tracking it allows you to have to understand players much deeper. I think for the last 5 years, we focused a lot on CPI optimization and leveraging machine learning. And without tracking, we have to focus back again to LTV, which is from the start of this conversation. It's like the dearest thing to me is how do you manage players and how do you make sure that every player has the best experience? So when IronSource reached out for this talk, right, it was before IDFA became a thing. It became rolled out. I think the industry is surviving. I don't think it was the apocalypse that everyone predicted. Is it harder? Yes. I think the revenue is definitely harder to generate. It requires more tricks. And that's exactly what I'm going to be going over in this presentation, is the strategies and the things that game developers can do and publishers can do to win in an age where you don't have perfect tracking. So really, when it comes down to LTV optimization or game optimization, we got to talk about the funnel. So, and this is really the structure for this talk, is understanding the funnel and the parts that you can optimize. The first one is pretty this is coming from a very different angle, but I hope you guys can follow, is, you got to start from the widest part of the funnel and work your way into the deepest part of the funnel. I'm a big believer that if you can move 1% in the top of the funnel, that has way bigger implications than moving 1% in like the deep funnel, which means that for this conversation and this talk here, I'm not going to talk about VIP players. VIP players is like 1% of a 1% type of player in your game. You can keep doing whatever you do there, but I'm going to talk about the bigger picture. So ASO is the first one. Then obviously ASO is totally passive. Like, that's just bringing the game up on the charts in a way. Then you have creative, which is advertising, and what can you do to optimize creatives to have better conversion rates and also bring more players that end up liking your game. Then you have ad monetization, which is probably the biggest passive income in free-to-play games. And there's a lot that can be done here to improve revenues. And then obviously there's game optimizations. Now that we don't control as much what kind of players that are coming into the game, you have to start thinking a lot more about how do you make the game fit the players that are coming in. You don't have a choice now to pick only the good ones, or only the ones that are super, hardcore players that like your MMO. You're going to have casual people play your MMO, and you have to adapt to that. So creative optimization, or optimizing creatives. It's really like the window into your game. And I personally search all the time for tycoon games on the App Store because I like tycoon games. And really all you have to judge a game by is the name and the icon. And so, before, without, like, if we had perfect tracking and we had really good advertising strategies with machine learning, developers could just rely on that. But now you have to rely on also organic traffic and the App Store itself. So here's a good example, right, is Warhammer. This is a game that we've been working with for a very long time. And in the earlier days, you could rely a lot on just the branding, right? People who like Warhammer would see this icon on the store and be like, oh, I like this game. I know the brand. I know what the gameplay is probably going to be about. And that would get us, pretty decent conversion. But if we're not relying just on like these hardcore people that know this niche, all of a sudden you have to start thinking a little bit more about how can you bring the player into the game and convince them that what is this game about, right? And so we've been seeing that a lot of successes recently in making the icons actually reflect what the game is about and not so much just rely on the brand. And so here is a good example, right, of a conversion rate that we improved by 57% just on, changing the icon. And this is really to show, explain to people what they're about to experience. Because ultimately it's a broad audience. The same thing is happening for us. We see a tilting point on the creative side in advertising. We have a huge team of artists working in Barcelona and New York, creating ads for all sorts of things. And we are always really interested to understand how to optimize it. We, for a long time, have had tools for, creating automatic variations of ads and trying to figure these things out like that, and using machine learning in the future to predict what is a good ad and a bad ad. And 5 years ago, this kind of thinking was kind of stuck in many ways. This like creative optimization, because every time you change an ad, Facebook would have to relearn what kind of user of Facebook, resonates the ad with. And now we are back without machine learning as much. And now we can do big changes. We can go big. And I think it's really exciting that we can really iterate on creatives. So, here's an example of SpongeBob. We launched this game last May. And again, it has a lot of the stories that you see from the icon I showed earlier. This ad fully banks on the hope that, this ad is being shown to people that like SpongeBob. They're probably, somewhere like millennials like myself or before. I don't know what I am these days. And you don't know what the game is about. All you know, it's a brand that you like, and the quality, the graphics, you kind of resonates with you maybe because it's closer to the cartoon itself, but that's about it. And back a year ago, we would be doing very minor changes to this, like we would change the copy, things that would allow us to make a change, but the machine learning algorithm would not have to fully relearn. And today, we're going crazy. We can do these things. We can actually demonstrate an idea of a gameplay. We can make players more curious, not about the fact that it's SpongeBob, because in this pixel art, it's kind of hard to even know that. But it gives you like the sense of like, ooh, I want to play a game like this, and that's what encourages people to click through. And that's like, I think, a strategy that everyone has to start adopting more is, experimenting with showing what the game is about. As I said, in the creative space of optimization, it's about moving away from the little incremental changes and making big changes. It is also about explaining the game mechanic and what you have to offer the player, because the player doesn't know anything about you. You might as well assume that. And the creative is the only way into the game to show them. And finally, capturing the player's imagination. They don't know anything about, it's basically showing a game to someone off the street, and you have to give them something to work with. Now, that is the biggest funnel opener, right? If you can get a couple more people to click through your ad or to click on an icon in the App Store, that inevitably will trickle down into more money at the end of the day, which is the whole topic of this conversation. But the other big one is ad monetization. So obviously this is iron source, so it's I think everyone here is pretty aware of how ad monetization works. But here's some of the things that we figured out in a tilting point that I want to share. So about 8 months ago, I did a talk about IDFA and the impeding doom, and this was a slide out of it. 75% drop in revenue. Crap, what is it going to happen to our player base and everything else? And yes, there is obviously a drop in revenue for players that have no tracking. That's clear. But I think the harshness and the chaos that it sounded back then, I think is a lot more under control. And I have some slides to illustrate this. So ad monetization and tracking, right? So this is a graph of our ratios of IDFA and IDFE. So as you can see, there was a time where we were happily having a lot of IDFA users, and slowly, step by step, we've been being replaced by IDFE users. And it's a gradual change. This is not suddenly from one day to the next, your entire player base changed over, which I think is really great for the transitional period. Had it changed over one day to the next, we would have to entirely rethink how we do ad monetization. The next thing is that the revenue coming from IDFA users versus IDFE users is basically, stable. We've always known that IDFE users were less valuable in terms of clicks, and we always knew that IDFA users were better. That has not changed. It's not like there were suspicions that IDFA users, the revenue would be way higher. There was concerns that there would be saturation of, in the IDFE user, and there would be no more ads for them, and then the revenue would drop or something like that. And that's not the case. It's very stable. So I think these are all things to consider, and I think that there's things that you can do. And here's the bits of insights that we've uncovered. First of all, there is networks that are really good for IDFE users. I personally didn't think about this like 8 months ago when I did the other talk, but it makes sense that some networks are going to become very specialized to catering to players that have no tracking. And here's a couple that we've had really good successes with, right? So Iron Source, Fungal, Yandex, they're pretty cool in the sense that they have an inventory, and it allows us to shift traffic there, and it works out very well. Similarly, I think with Yandex a little, but in general is another good strategy is to start getting more specific about the ad networks you work with, specifically like the niche ones in like Latin America and Southeast Asia. The best networks oftentimes are the niche ones because they have a very specific audience that they cater to, and they're pretty unknown. And I think if you are an early adopter in these networks, and you have the energy and the capacity to operate more networks, it definitely makes sense to start looking there. The other part is there is, some networks that don't cater to IDFA. They only cater to IDFA. And an example of that is Facebook ads. And that's cool too. I think it's very nice that some places are very clear cut in this decision. And I think it just, you just have to optimize to this. One thing that does happen from having networks that only cater to one, or if you figure this out through just visualizing the data, is that you have to start shifting the traffic to other places, right? So if all the traffic was going to Facebook ads, you have to start now delineating this and segmenting players out. The other part, obviously, which comes right out of this topic is waterfall optimizations. This is nothing new. I mean, this has been done since 2010. I think it's a fascinating exercise all the time to manage waterfalls. But it used to be that people were discussing, A/B testing waterfalls, and people would be tuning waterfalls all the time. But I think finally there is a really cool use case for waterfalls and A/B testing. And that is that you have to start having two different waterfalls, one for IDFA users and one for IDFV users. And this is our SpongeBob example. Not that we're showing you what our waterfall actually is, but it's cool because this is ultimately what games have been doing for LTV optimization inside their games for a decade, right? Is figuring out a trait that the player has and adjusting the mechanics, in this case with ads, to fit their playing profile. And this is no different, and it works really well. And I think, as I said, right, like things like Facebook don't have IDFV users, so you have to start doing this anyways. What it does mean, though, is that it does take twice as much work to optimize a game. So we've talked about, the broad spectrum. We spoken about like the passive way of monetizing the players with ads and rewarded ads, even if you think about that. And now we're going to go deeper into game optimization. Now, for a long time, when there was Facebook machine learning algorithms for optimizing, the targeting, and when the Facebook would be doing the targeting, you didn't really have to care so much about the game optimization in many ways. You could survive almost without optimizing the game. And you can see that in hyper casual games. You can optimize to get a funnel of players in, or a stream of players in. You have ad revenue that is very stable because you show an ad every time the player loses a match. And it almost, that has a proven equation, LTV to CPI equation there. But now that you can't have such a steady stream of players, you have to broaden and start thinking about the various kinds of player types. And not just like, the traditional sense of like, oh, there's minnows, whales, dolphins of spenders. You have to start thinking about, there is passive players, there's casual players, there's hardcore players, there's players that are looking to socialize, there's players that are looking to just, play on the subway once a day and that's it. Other players are trying to, make their whole lives around this one title. And you have to optimize for those things. So the simplest optimization that really works, and I think every game should be having something like this, is pricing optimizations. And this is coming out of the very basic concept that games are a multivariate problem. If you think about every number in a game that you've hard-coded in, that's a number that you should question, like, why? How did we come up with this number? Where does it come from? How is it optimized, and is it optimal for this game? And this is anything from like, how often do you show an ad? This is how many coins do you offer to a player when they are playing, watching an ad? Like, do you offer them 5 gems to watch an ad, or do you offer 10 gems? Similarly, you can think about level progression. Where are the paywalls in the game? And all those things were decisions made by, in probably some spreadsheet somewhere by a game designer. And they're all up for debate, I feel, for optimizing further. And so, like, even in this talk, if you think about it, we've been talking about one dimension already. It's the players that have IDFA tracking versus players that only have IDFE tracking. And we've spoken about how 2 waterfalls can be used in this case, so that you clearly segment players out that way. But there's a whole other one. There's one that's 180 item levels of dimension or granularities. It's every country in the world is unique. And what I think is always funny is that game developers make games thinking about a very specific type of player, usually who they are, basically. And what they don't realize is that every time you make a game, you're basically making a multinational company in your basement, and the whole world is going to use this game. So you have to start thinking about, well, why do I charge $1 for 100 coins? Why is it that I'm charging $1 also in India for 100 coins? Is it worth $1 in India for 100 coins? And we've done this many, many times. I had a business doing this, and there is always really interesting results. So this is actually results that we did from SpongeBob, the game that I showed the creators for earlier, and simply tuning the pricing of the in-app purchases in the game and tuning them by country, which is a very broad, stroke. I mean, you're not talking about anything about types of players, as I mentioned. You're not talking about their behavior in the game. I'm just talking about just general, the person walks in. If you do a change of prices, you do get results. So Peru, the ARPDAU rate rose by 34%. Ukraine, 74%. And even, if you run a test for long enough, and this does require long enough, you can actually start measuring even smaller ARPDAUs of 2.5% in the Philippines. And again, this is something that's really neat, is that pricing, unlike level design or changing, any kind of mechanic in the game of like how often like the spin the wheel of fortune mechanic works, like all of those things are more complicated, but pricing is a number you can change. In Google, which is not part of this talk, you can actually even do it remotely already. And you get pretty cool results probably within the first month. The other one is optimizing retention. This is kind of like a weird one for a talk about optimizing monetization or monetization post-IDFA, but I think it's even more important today. Basically, we've spoken about the top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, and now there's a part that's often really forgotten, which is like, how do you optimize like the exit out of your game? And what are you doing about that part? The part about optimizing retention is that there's many levels, and I think it's really interesting to think like in levels of like audience that you can target and what the efficacy of that audience is, right? So the highest audience is obviously the people in the game, and obviously has a huge efficacy because if you open the game, you're clearly retained. I think what's interesting in in-app messaging and retention is that when players are going to churn. It's outside of the scope of this talk, but when their last session is. Churn prediction is a very stable thing in machine learning. You can predict it. There are service providers out there that do predict churn, and you can associate, if there's a likelihood of 60% of a player churning, you should probably give them some incentive to stick around. I mean, it's the same thing with coffee shops, right? Like if you go to a coffee shop all the time and one day you have a bad cup of coffee, the next time it would be in 3 days, you have another bad cup of coffee. It's pretty obvious that you're probably not going to return to this coffee shop after that second cup. There probably is going to be a week without ever coming back. You come back one last time a week later and that's it. And the same thing with games. Like I see myself with playing games. I can play a game every day, multiple times a day. And then slowly I'll skip a weekend, I'll skip 3 days and so on. And by the end, I never play the game again. And that's the opportunity to give players something. And I think that's where it comes back to retention. If you know that they're going to churn, give them 100 coins. I don't know, give them the faster car just for free. Because honestly, they're already churning and you'll never make any more money. At least give them a good experience. Secondly is push notifications. This is like the spammy thing that you can do. It takes a lot of talent to pull it off with class, I feel, but it definitely works. We do it in all our games and everyone should be doing it often. And I'm gonna show you some examples of how we do push notifications in SpongeBob. It's just a must. There's no way around it. It gives you a couple percentages of retention back. It brings people back, and out of those small percentage of players that do come back, some convert still. There is still chances of bringing them back to full life, and it's something everyone should be doing. The next one is email. Email is like the holy grail of retention, I feel, because if a player was so engaged with your game that they gave you their email, they like you, and I think they trust you too. And we've found that email is by far the most effective way of bringing players back to life. You can still give, the incentive. I would encourage to give an incentive for the player to return, but there is no doubt that email is the best way to go about this. And then finally, there's retargeting, which is somewhat of a dying thing with tracking, but it's still kind of possible sometimes. And it is, to try to find them again through a different channel. So what does this mean in terms of what's a retention, strategy? So here in SpongeBob, this is the new user one, right? So after the first day that they play, we start sequentially doing day 1, D3, and D7 re-engagement strategies, right? Oftentimes, this is by push notification. And we see that, this cadence actually works out pretty well in bringing back a couple percentage of players who otherwise would have fallen through the cracks. The really cool thing about retention too, if you think about it, is that you've already spent money to attain the players in the first place. So every time you retain a player again, you're basically, recouping some of the costs that you put into it. And then there's also the inactive strategy. This is for players that have not come back for a couple days. And in SpongeBob, we actually push the rewards later in the game, later in the retention strategy, right? So on day 1, we just say, hey, we haven't seen you, because it happens, right? I mean, it's like coffee shop examples. Maybe it rained today, or maybe the player had a wedding and they couldn't play the game. We start getting worried on day 7. And we definitely get worried also at day 1 for some players, in the sense that if they haven't come back in 7 days, you have to start giving them something of value. And the problem is that you can't do this too many times. I've seen, in other games where if you give them something on day 7 and they don't convert, it doesn't do you a lot on day 30 to say, hey, here's even more coins, because at this point they really don't care, and actually it just devalues the whole game. So I wouldn't go further into, you have to choose the day you're going to give them the reward and make sure that that reward is sufficient to convert them back. So that's it. These are some strategies for monetizing and post-IDFA. I think, again, this slide came out of last year. It's kind of funny because this is Zombieland. And at the time we were like, oh man, 2020 was bad. Imagine how bad 2021 is going to be. And I don't think that's the case. I think everything is going to turn out pretty okay. As you can see, there's a big strategy here in the sense that you have to start thinking about games holistically. For a long time, for the last 5 years at least, I think we've managed to kind of forget some parts of optimization and just relied on machine learning for a lot of it, or relied a lot on the fact that we had tracking and there was enough value in the data being shared around that you didn't have to optimize the game further manually. And 2021, I think, is a fantastic year to start doing things by hand again and start getting really into the details about ASO, creatives, ad monetization, and game monetization in general. So how do you amplify a game and how do you monetize a game post-IDFA, right? I think the first step in a successful 2021 is just understanding the privacy is progressing. It's going to keep progressing. We have IDFA being deprecated today. There is no doubt that someday in the future, similar things will happen with Google, and we can even be more private. There is probably a day somewhere, in the future where maybe we don't have anything about a player except the fact that they play the game and we know how they play. So I think you have to keep updating your playbook of game monetization and just keep, doing things to improve and get around the privacy limitations and actually really focus on making a better game, because ultimately a better game does not need anything about tracking. You can have a perfect game without tracking. I mean, consoles for decades were great games with zero tracking. Top of the funnel optimization, I think, is really important now. You can't rely on other people doing it for you. You have to take ownership of that. I think in the past, especially even from a data science perspective, I was kind of told, hey man, we can't do too many changes too quickly because it changes. The networks don't like when you make too many changes. Like, make few changes and small ones at that. Now I think it's like this wonderful golden years again, rebirth of creative optimization, where you can do big changes often. And I think everyone should be doing as many as possible. Ad monetization, I like to think of it just got twice as hard. I don't know if that's from my experience in ad monetization. There's 2 waterfalls now that you have to think about. And I think there's different networks for each one of them. And that just means that the dimensionality of the problem doubled. And you got to do what you got to do. But that's definitely for free-to-play games especially, is definitely very important to do it. Price optimization is probably the lowest hanging fruit for most game developers out there to make an impact on changing the game for different players. And that has nothing to do with privacy, even if you think about it. It has simply to do with the fact that in the old days, you design games around a very specific player profile. And now you have to accommodate the fact that there's many profiles and you should be open to all profiles. Similarly, I think for a couple of years, you could have said, oh, my game is only for tier 1 countries or English-speaking countries. That's a huge opportunity left on the table for countries that don't speak English or are in an economy that's not the same as a tier 1 country. So price optimization is an easy thing to do. It's just a number. You can do a little bit more sophisticated things about messaging to make it appear more special to a player, what the pricing is. But ultimately, it's just a number. You should be doing it. And finally, retaining players, right? There's a lot of talk always, I think, about how to bring players into the game. There is also full conferences all about how to optimize the game, right? That's basically GDC in a nutshell. It's like a lot of people talking about how to make the best game possible. Not so much about how to retain players. And I think that's a huge opportunity that most games need to double up on, is how to bring players back. I don't honestly know a game I've played recently from another developer who said, hey, Andre, it looks like you're about to churn. Here's 100 gems just for you. Because get yourself some cool stuff in the game before you leave forever. And I personally would really appreciate that. So that's it. Thank you. This is How to Survive 2021, Monetization Post-IDFA. And I can be reached, in the internet any way possible that you can reach. And yeah, have a good 2021 with IDFA.